Flight 227, we need you to wake up the little girl in seat 14A. Her name is Emma. Tell her we know about her father. Tell her we need her to save everyone on that plane. Now. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe. Nobody on Flight 227 knew that the quiet 12-year-old reading a book in the middle of the cabin would soon be the only thing standing between 300 passengers and certain death. The flight attendants had checked on her twice, offering her extra cookies and asking if she needed help with anything in that gentle voice adults use with children traveling alone. The businessman in 14B had smiled at her politely before putting in his earbuds, probably thinking she was just another kid flying to visit divorced parents or attend summer camp. The elderly woman across the aisle had even offered her a mint, treating her exactly like what she appeared to be, a typical middle school student with a backpack full of schoolbooks, a tablet loaded with games, and absolutely no ability to handle anything more complex than ordering a soda from the beverage cart. Emma had smiled back at all of them, thanked the flight attendants and returned to her book, never once mentioning that she had spent the last 4 years studying every emergency procedure in the Boeing 737 operating manual, that she had logged over 2,000 hours on professional flight simulators, or that her father had been drilling her on emergency landings since she was 8 years old because he believed that knowledge could save lives even if regulation said she was too young to touch real controls. The aircraft had departed from Chicago O'Hare at 3:47 p.m., 17 minutes behind schedule due to a minor maintenance check that the gate agent had announced with practiced apologetic tones over the intercom. Emma had listened carefully to every word of the safety briefing even though the adults around her were scrolling through phones and flipping through magazines, having heard the same speech hundreds of times before and considering it nothing more than regulatory theater that they could safely ignore. She had counted the rows to the nearest exit, noted the location of the emergency equipment, and observed that the flight crew seemed experienced and professional as they moved through the cabin checking overhead bins and reminding passengers to stow their bags. Everything seemed completely normal as Flight 227 climbed through 20,000 feet heading northwest toward Seattle, the captain's voice coming over the intercom with the standard welcome message about flying time, weather conditions, and the cabin crew beginning beverage service shortly. Emma had opened her book again, a novel about a girl her age solving mysteries, though the real mystery was how none of the 300 people around her had any idea what she was capable of doing if something went terribly wrong. The first sign of trouble came 32 minutes into the flight when the lead flight attendant, a woman named Jennifer with 15 years of experience, noticed that the cockpit had not responded to her last 2 calls on the intercom. She tried again, pressing the call button and waiting for the familiar click and response from either the captain or first officer, but received only silence that made her frown slightly though she did not yet feel any real concern. Jennifer walked to the cockpit door and used the security phone, following standard procedures for checking on flight crew, but again received no response, which was unusual but not yet alarming since the pilots might be dealing with some minor technical issue that required their full attention. She waited another minute, then tried the intercom again, her voice now carrying a slight edge of concern as she asked if everything was all right up front, and when the silence continued she felt the first real stirring of worry that something might actually be wrong. Following her training, Jennifer used her security code to unlock the cockpit door, expecting to find the pilots focused on instruments or dealing with some communication problem, but what she saw instead made her blood turn to ice and her hand instinctively reach for the nearest solid surface to steady herself. Both pilots were slumped in their seats, completely unconscious, with the captain's head tilted forward against his chest and the first officer leaning sideways against the window in a position that looked almost peaceful except for the terrifying reality that nobody was flying the airplane. The autopilot was engaged and holding the aircraft steady at 38,000 feet, but Jennifer knew enough about aviation to understand that autopilot could not handle emergencies, could not make decisions, could not land the plane, and would simply keep flying the programmed route until the fuel ran out and 300 people fell from the sky. She grabbed the captain's shoulder and shook him hard, calling his name repeatedly with increasing desperation, but he did not respond at all, his breathing shallow and his skin looking pale and slightly bluish in the harsh cockpit lighting. The first officer was equally unresponsive, and Jennifer's aviation first aid training immediately suggested carbon monoxide poisoning or some other toxic contamination that had affected both pilots simultaneously, though she had no time to diagnose the problem because the immediate crisis was that a commercial airliner was flying at 600 miles per hour with no conscious crew and hundreds of people who were about to die unless someone could figure out what to do in the next few minutes. Jennifer pulled the cockpit door closed behind her and forced herself to stay calm, knowing that panic would kill everyone aboard just as surely as the unconscious pilots would if she could not find a solution. She grabbed the public address microphone with shaking hands and made an announcement that she tried to keep steady and professional even though her heart was hammering against her ribs hard enough to hurt. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your lead flight attendant speaking. If there is anyone on board with flight experience, any pilots, military aviators, or flight instructors, please press your call button immediately. This is an emergency situation and we need your help right now. She waited, scanning the cabin desperately for call lights, praying that some off-duty airline pilot or experienced aviator was aboard, but the seconds ticked by with agonizing slowness and not a single call button illuminated because this was an ordinary weekday flight full of business travelers, families, and tourists with no particular aviation expertise among them. Jennifer made the announcement again, her voice cracking slightly this time, and still nobody responded because the simple terrible truth was that there was nobody on Flight 227 who knew how to fly a commercial airliner except the two unconscious men in the cockpit. Meanwhile, at Minneapolis Air Traffic Control Center, Controller David Chen was monitoring Flight 227's progress on his radar screen when he noticed that the aircraft had stopped responding to routine position reports and frequency changes. He tried raising the flight on the radio several times, using increasingly urgent tones, but received no response, which immediately elevated his concern level from routine to potentially serious. David checked with other controllers to see if Flight 227 had accidentally switched to the wrong frequency, a common enough mistake, but none of his colleagues had heard from the aircraft either, which meant something was definitely wrong. He declared an emergency situation and began coordinating with other facilities, pulling up the flight's passenger manifest and crew information while simultaneously alerting emergency response teams and preparing for whatever crisis might be developing at 38,000 feet. The transponder was still squawking normally and the aircraft was maintaining altitude and course under autopilot, but the complete radio silence from a commercial flight was a massive red flag that could indicate anything from radio failure to hijacking to catastrophic crew incapacitation. David's supervisor, Margaret Torres, appeared at his shoulder within seconds of the emergency declaration, her 28 years of air traffic control experience telling her immediately that this situation was about to become one of those incidents that would be studied in aviation safety courses for decades to come. She took over coordination with emergency services while David focused on trying every possible method to contact Flight 227, including relaying messages through other aircraft in the area and attempting to trigger the cockpit alert system using emergency codes. Nothing worked, and the aircraft continued its programmed flight path like a ghost ship sailing steadily toward disaster while 300 souls aboard remained completely unaware that both pilots were unconscious and their survival now depended on finding anyone who could take control of an aircraft they had never been trained to fly. Margaret was scrolling through the passenger manifest looking for any indication of aviation experience, running names through databases that might show pilot licenses or military aviation backgrounds, when she noticed something that made her stop and stare at the screen with an expression that mixed hope with absolute horror at what she was about to propose. Passenger Emma Catherine Morrison, age 12, traveling alone in seat 14A, student pilot license on file with notation of extensive simulator training, daughter of Captain James Morrison, retired Air Force pilot and current 737 type rating instructor. Margaret's hands were actually shaking as she processed this information, knowing that what she was about to suggest violated every regulation, every protocol, every reasonable standard of aviation safety, but also knowing that conventional approaches had already failed and desperate situations required desperate measures even when those measures involved asking a 12-year-old child to save 300 lives. She grabbed David's shoulder and showed him the information on the screen, watching his eyes widen as he understood the impossible choice they were facing. Do nothing and watch Flight 227 eventually run out of fuel and crash, killing everyone aboard, or attempt to talk a middle school student through landing a commercial airliner, something that seemed so absurd and dangerous that even suggesting it felt insane. David looked at Margaret, and in that moment of silent communication between two experienced controllers who had seen almost everything aviation could throw at them, they both understood that they had no choice at all, that Emma Morrison represented the only possible chance for survival no matter how slim that chance might be. David transmitted on the emergency frequency, his voice deliberately calm and professional despite the surreal nature of what he was about to say. Flight 227, this is Minneapolis Center on emergency frequency 121.5. We need to speak with passenger Emma Morrison in seat 14A. Flight attendants, please locate Emma Morrison immediately and bring her to the cockpit. Emma, if you can hear this transmission, we know about your father, we know about your training, and we need your help right now. The message seemed to hang in the air for an eternal moment before Jennifer's voice came back shaky and confused, asking for confirmation of what she had just heard. unable to believe that air traffic control was asking her to bring a child to the cockpit of an aircraft with unconscious pilots. David repeated the instruction with more authority, explaining that Emma had aviation training and was listed as their best option for establishing control of the aircraft. And though Jennifer's response contained obvious reluctance and concern, she acknowledged the instruction because when air traffic control declares an emergency and gives specific directions, flight attendants are trained to follow those directions even when they seem to make no sense at all. Emma had heard the announcement through the aircraft speaker system and was already unbuckling her seatbelt when Jennifer appeared at her row, the flight attendant's face showing a mixture of hope and terror that Emma had never seen before in an adult's expression. The businessman in 14B was staring at both of them with complete confusion, having heard the controller's message but unable to process the idea that the quiet kid next to him might somehow be connected to whatever emergency was happening. Emma stood up and followed Jennifer toward the front of the cabin, her mind already shifting into the mode her father had trained her to use during emergencies. Calm assessment, systematic thinking, focus on procedures rather than emotions, and absolute confidence in the knowledge she had spent years acquiring. The other passengers were starting to realize something serious was wrong, their faces showing concern and fear as they watched a child being escorted to the cockpit, and Emma could hear whispered questions and worried conversations starting to spread through the cabin like ripples across water. Jennifer opened the cockpit door and Emma stepped inside, taking in the scene with a quick professional glance that cataloged everything. Both pilots unconscious, autopilot engaged, aircraft stable, instruments showing normal parameters except for a subtle indication that made her eyes narrow with instant recognition. The cockpit environmental system display showed a slight irregularity in the air circulation pattern, and Emma's training immediately suggested carbon monoxide contamination as the most likely cause of dual pilot incapacitation, a rare but known emergency that her father had made her study extensively because it was both deadly and survivable if caught early enough. She moved to the captain's seat and pressed the transmit button on the radio, her young voice suddenly filling the speakers at Minneapolis Center with words that made David Chin close his eyes in relief so profound he felt physically weak. Minneapolis Center, this is Emma Morrison in the cockpit of Flight 227. I have both pilots unconscious, suspected carbon monoxide poisoning based on environmental system readings. I am trained on 737 systems and emergency procedures. Please advise on immediate actions and prepare for emergency landing coordination. The professional terminology and calm delivery coming from a 12-year-old's voice created a moment of cognitive dissonance so powerful that several controllers in the room actually stopped what they were doing to stare at David's station, unable to reconcile the age of the speaker with the competence of the transmission. David responded immediately, his voice taking on the role of mentor and guide that would define every second of the next 47 minutes. Emma, outstanding work identifying the contamination. First priority, open all cockpit vents and turn fresh air to maximum. Put on oxygen masks if available. Then we'll assess your parents' condition and begin emergency descent. Emma was already moving as he spoke, her hands finding the environmental controls with the confidence born from hundreds of simulator sessions where her father had made her practice emergency procedures until they became automatic muscle memory. She opened the cockpit vents fully, feeling fresh air begin to circulate, then located the oxygen masks and placed one on the captain's face, adjusting the flow to maximum before doing the same for the first officer. Jennifer was standing behind her, watching this child perform actions with the precision of an experienced crew member, and the flight attendant had to grip the door frame to keep her knees from buckling as the impossible reality of the situation fully registered in her mind. Emma returned to the radio and confirmed the actions completed, then asked for guidance on beginning emergency descent, her voice still steady though David could detect the slight tension that suggested she was fully aware of the enormous responsibility now resting on her young shoulders. Margaret Torres had joined David at his station and was already coordinating with emergency services at multiple airports, calculating fuel range and identifying the best landing options while David focused entirely on talking Emma through each step of the emergency. He began with the descent, explaining that she needed to disengage the autopilot altitude hold and manually set a lower altitude to get the aircraft down to 10,000 feet where the air would be thicker and safer if there were any oxygen issues in the cabin. Emma acknowledged and reported that she was familiar with the autopilot controls from simulator training, then described each action as she performed it. Disengaging altitude hold, setting new altitude of 10,000 feet, engaging vertical speed mode, and monitoring the descent rate to ensure a gradual comfortable descent that would not alarm the passengers or stress the aircraft. The big Boeing began dropping smoothly through the flight levels, and David could see on his radar screen that Emma was executing the descent with precision that some professional pilots would struggle to match, her training translating into real-world performance in a way that seemed almost miraculous given the circumstances. In the cabin, passengers were starting to notice the descent and the unusual activity around the cockpit, and worried conversations were growing louder as people demanded to know what was happening. Jennifer made a decision that required every ounce of her professional courage and returned to the public address system, her voice somehow steady as she delivered news that seemed like something from a disaster movie rather than real life. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your lead flight attendant. Both of our pilots have been incapacitated due to a medical emergency, but we have a trained individual in the cockpit who is working with air traffic control to safely land this aircraft. Please remain calm, stay seated with your seatbelts fastened, and follow all instructions from the flight crew. We are executing an emergency descent and will be landing as soon as possible. The announcement created an immediate uproar of shocked voices and frightened questions, but Jennifer stood at the front of the cabin with her arms raised, repeating that everyone needed to stay calm and that the situation was under control, though her own mind was screaming with the knowledge that trained individual was a 12-year-old girl and under control was a massive overstatement of their current reality. Emma was now passing through 25,000 feet in a controlled descent, and David was talking her through the next critical steps: reducing airspeed, configuring the aircraft for descent, and preparing for eventual approach and landing procedures that would require precision she had only practiced in simulations. Margaret had identified Minneapolis-St. Paul International as the best landing option based on runway length, emergency services availability, and Emma's fuel situation, and she was already coordinating with the airport to clear all traffic and prepare for an emergency landing that would involve an untrained child at the controls. David explained to Emma that they would be vectoring her to Minneapolis, that she would have plenty of fuel for multiple approach attempts if needed, and that every available resource would be dedicated to talking her through a successful landing. Emma acknowledged the information and asked about the pilot's conditions, showing a presence of mind that allowed her to multitask between flying the aircraft and concern for the incapacitated crew members, and David felt a surge of confidence that maybe, just maybe, this impossible situation might actually have a survivable outcome. The pilots were still unconscious but breathing more normally now that they had oxygen masks, suggesting that Emma's carbon monoxide diagnosis had been correct and that fresh air circulation was helping clear the contamination from the cockpit. Emma reported these observations to David with the clinical detachment of someone conducting a medical assessment, and he realized that her father had trained her not just in flying procedures but in the kind of crisis management that separated professional pilots from amateurs. She asked permission to have Jennifer bring her a bottle of water and energy bar from the galley, explaining that she needed to maintain her blood sugar and hydration for the mental focus required during landing procedures, and David approved immediately while marveling at the fact that a 12-year-old had the presence of mind to think about physiological needs during an emergency that would have most adults paralyzed with fear. Jennifer brought the requested items along with an encouraging smile that Emma returned with a brief nod before returning her attention to the instruments, understanding that encouragement was nice but professional execution was what would actually save lives. Flight 227 was now descending through 15,000 feet, and David began talking Emma through the approach procedures that would eventually lead to landing, explaining each step in clear simple language while also using proper terminology because he had quickly learned that Emma understood technical aviation concepts better than many adults. He described how they would vector her to a long straight-in approach to runway 12L at Minneapolis, a procedure that would give her maximum time to stabilize the aircraft and prepare for landing without requiring complex turns or navigational challenges. Emma listened carefully and asked intelligent questions about wind conditions, runway length, and the location of emergency equipment, showing that she was thinking ahead to potential complications and planning for contingencies just as her training had taught her. Margaret was watching the radar display and coordinating with Minneapolis Tower, and she found herself feeling something she had never expected to feel in this situation. Genuine hope that a child might actually pull off a successful emergency landing that would be talked about in aviation circles for generations. David walked Emma through reducing power and beginning to configure the aircraft for landing, explaining how to extend flaps and stages and monitor airspeed to prevent stalling or overspeeding during configuration changes. Emma's hands moved across the controls with careful deliberation, extending the first stage of flaps and reporting the airspeed and aircraft response, waiting for David's confirmation before proceeding to the next stage. The Boeing was responding beautifully to her inputs, descending smoothly through 10,000 feet with passengers in the cabin watching in terrified fascination as mountains and landscape features became visible below, making the emergency suddenly real in a way that flying at cruise altitude had not. Jennifer had briefed the other flight attendants on the situation, and they were moving through the cabin preparing passengers for emergency landing procedures, demonstrating brace positions and checking that everyone understood the importance of following instructions exactly when the time came to land. The cabin had taken on an eerie quiet punctuated by occasional sobs and whispered prayers, 300 people united in their complete dependence on a child they could not see but whose voice occasionally came over the speakers reporting positions and altitudes to air traffic control. Emma was now being vectored by Minneapolis Approach Control, a new voice on the radio belonging to Controller Sarah Martinez who specialized in approach procedures and would guide Emma through the final phase of the emergency. Sarah had been fully briefed on the situation and had studied Emma's simulator training records that Margaret had somehow obtained through emergency channels, learning that this remarkable child had practiced emergency landings dozens of times though never in actual aircraft and never with 300 lives depending on her performance. Sarah's first transmission to Emma was calm and confident, establishing the relationship that would carry them through the next 20 minutes, and she began by telling Emma that she was doing an outstanding job and that everyone was proud of her courage and skill. Emma responded with simple acknowledgement, not needing praise but not rejecting it either, and asked for vectors to begin the approach to runway 12L, showing that she was ready to move forward with the procedure that would determine whether everyone lived or died in the next half hour. The aircraft was now at 5,000 feet and 15 miles from the airport, and Sarah began providing headings that would position Emma for a long final approach, each instruction given clearly with confirmation required before proceeding to the next step. Emma was hand-flying the aircraft now, having disconnected the autopilot on David's earlier instruction so that she could develop a feel for the controls and build the muscle memory that would be essential during landing. The big Boeing responded to her inputs with the slightly sluggish feel of a large aircraft at low speed, and Emma made small corrections to maintain heading and altitude while managing power settings and monitoring multiple instruments simultaneously. Sarah could see on her radar screen that Emma's track was remarkably stable, the aircraft holding centerline with precision that suggested either exceptional natural ability or training so thorough that it had become instinctive. In the Minneapolis Tower, every controller and supervisor was watching the approach, and emergency vehicles were lined up along the runway with crews ready to respond instantly if the landing went wrong in any of the 100 ways that seemed possible when an untrained child was at the controls of a commercial airliner. Emma extended the landing gear on Sarah's instruction, feeling the aircraft shudder slightly as the massive wheels lowered into the slipstream, and she compensated for the increased drag by adjusting power to maintain her target airspeed of 140 knots. Sarah talked her through the final flap extension, bringing the aircraft to full landing configuration, and Emma reported 3 green lights indicating that the gear was down and locked properly, her voice showing the first hint of strain as the workload intensified and the reality of actually landing the aircraft began to dominate her awareness. She was now on a 10-mile final approach, the runway visible ahead as a thin line of lights against the landscape, and Sarah began providing detailed guidance on maintaining the glide path and airspeed that would bring the aircraft safely to the runway. Emma's hands were gripping the controls with white-knuckled intensity, and she was talking herself through each step in a quiet voice that the radio was picking up, a stream of self-coaching that revealed the internal dialogue of someone executing procedures under enormous pressure. The Boeing was descending through 1,000 feet, 8 miles from touchdown, and Sarah provided constant reassurance and gentle corrections as Emma made small adjustments to keep the aircraft on the proper glide path. The passengers could see the airport now, and Jennifer had them in brace position with their heads down and hands protecting their skulls, the emergency landing procedures that might save lives if the landing was hard or the aircraft skidded off the runway. Emma was focused entirely on the instruments and the visual picture through the windscreen, trying to maintain the stable approach her father had taught her was essential for safe landing, fighting against the instinct to over-control and instead making small smooth inputs that kept the aircraft tracking toward the runway. She was passing 500 feet now, 3 miles from touchdown, and Sarah told her she was doing perfectly and to just continue exactly what she was doing, the controller's voice containing absolute confidence even though Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. At 200 feet Emma experienced a moment of pure terror as a gust of wind pushed the aircraft slightly off centerline and she had to make a correction that felt too large and too sudden, but the Boeing responded well and she got back on track, Sarah's voice immediately reassuring her that wind correction was completely normal and she had handled it exactly right. Emma was flying now on pure instinct and training, her conscious mind almost detached as the procedures her father had drilled into her took over, her hands and feet making corrections without deliberate thought, her eyes scanning instruments in the pattern she had practiced thousands of times. The runway threshold was approaching fast, and Sarah began the final countdown, providing altitude callouts every 50 feet as Emma made minute adjustments to power and pitch to control the descent rate. 50 feet, 40 feet, 30 feet, and Emma was pulling power back while raising the nose slightly, trying to arrest the descent rate and achieve the gentle touchdown her father had always said was the mark of a professional pilot, and the aircraft seemed to float for an eternal moment before the main wheels contacted the runway with a slight chirp of rubber on concrete. Emma's training took over completely as she lowered the nose wheel to the runway, deployed the speed brakes exactly as she had practiced, and applied the brakes with steady progressive pressure while keeping the aircraft aligned with the centerline using rudder pedals that her short legs could barely reach. The Boeing decelerated rapidly, and Emma maintained control as the speed bled off, the aircraft tracking straight down the runway while emergency vehicles raced alongside ready to intervene if anything went wrong. She brought the aircraft to a complete stop on the runway, set the parking brake, and pulled the fuel cutoff levers to shut down both engines, completing the emergency procedure exactly as trained. Then, and only then, did Emma allow herself to feel the emotion she had been suppressing for the last 47 minutes, her body beginning to shake as the adrenaline drained away and the full magnitude of what had just happened crashed over her like a physical force. Sarah's voice came over the radio one final time, filled with emotion that professional controllers rarely display. "Emma, that was absolutely incredible. You saved every single person on that airplane. Emergency crews are approaching now to help with your pilots and evacuate the passengers. You did it, Emma. You really did it." Emma tried to respond but found her voice would not work. The words stuck somewhere between her brain and her mouth, and she simply sat in the captain's seat with tears streaming down her face while Jennifer burst into the cockpit and wrapped her arms around the child who had just accomplished something that seemed impossible. The emergency crews reached the aircraft within seconds, medics rushing aboard to assess the pilots who were beginning to show signs of consciousness as the oxygen and fresh air cleared the carbon monoxide from their systems. Passengers were evacuated down emergency slides, many of them crying and hugging each other, while others demanded to know who had landed the plane and whether it was really true that a child had saved them all. The story broke on news channels within minutes, reporters gathering at Minneapolis Airport to cover the emergency landing that had every aviation expert shaking their heads in disbelief. Emma was taken to a quiet room where she was checked by medics, interviewed by investigators, and eventually reunited with her mother who had flown in from Seattle on an emergency flight after receiving word that her daughter was involved in an aviation incident. The woman collapsed when she learned what Emma had done, unable to process the information that her 12-year-old daughter had landed a commercial airliner and saved 300 lives using training that her ex-husband had provided against her explicit wishes because she had always thought it was too dangerous and too intense for a child. The pilots recovered fully, their gratitude to Emma almost religious in its intensity, and the captain later said that what bothered him most about the whole incident was not that he had been unconscious but that a child had been put in a position where she had to use skills that professionals trained for years to develop. The investigation revealed that a faulty environmental system gasket had allowed carbon monoxide from the auxiliary power unit to enter the cockpit air supply, a rare mechanical failure that had occurred just after takeoff and gradually incapacitated both pilots before they could recognize the problem. Emma's quick diagnosis had saved not just the pilots but potentially prevented the contamination from spreading to the cabin where it might have affected passengers and crew. The National Transportation Safety Board praised her actions while also raising uncomfortable questions about aviation training for minors and whether her father's instruction methods had been appropriate or had placed a child in a position that should never have existed. Emma's father was interviewed and defended his training philosophy, arguing that knowledge was never dangerous and that Emma's education had literally saved lives, proving that age limitations on aviation training were arbitrary and potentially harmful if they prevented capable individuals from acquiring life-saving skills. Emma herself struggled with the aftermath in ways that adults around her did not anticipate, experiencing nightmares about all the things that could have gone wrong and survivors' guilt about the fact that she had succeeded while others with more experience might have failed. Therapists worked with her to process the trauma of the experience, helping her understand that she had performed remarkably but that the burden of responsibility placed on her shoulders had been unfair and damaging in ways that might take years to fully understand. She became famous overnight, appearing on talk shows and news programs where hosts treated her like a celebrity, though Emma found the attention uncomfortable and intrusive, wishing people would forget about the incident so she could return to normal 12-year-old activities. Airlines began reviewing their emergency procedures, considering whether to implement programs that might identify passengers with aviation training and how to communicate with them during emergencies, while regulators debated whether the miracle landing should inspire more accessible flight training or stricter controls on who could learn aviation procedures. 6 months later, Emma was presented with a Medal of Valor from the Federal Aviation Administration and received personal letters of thanks from every passenger who had been aboard Flight 227, some of them calling her an angel sent by God and others simply expressing gratitude that a remarkable child had been in the right place with the right skills at the exact moment when the impossible became necessary. The businessman who had sat in 14B wrote that he would never again dismiss young people as just kids because Emma had taught him that courage and competence had no age requirement. Jennifer, the lead flight attendant, stayed in touch with Emma and became like a second mother to her, checking in regularly and offering support as Emma worked through the psychological aftermath of an experience that would have broken many adults. The pilots both returned to flying after medical clearance, though the captain admitted he now experienced anxiety when environmental system warnings appeared, his mind instantly returning to the moment when he lost consciousness and left his aircraft in the hands of a child passenger. Emma eventually requested that her student pilot license be suspended, telling her father that she never wanted to fly again and that the experience had taken something from her that she needed time to recover. Her father honored her request, though it clearly pained him, understanding that his daughter had paid a price for her training that he had never anticipated when he began teaching her emergency procedures in the safety of a simulator. Emma returned to school where classmates treated her with a mixture of awe and awkwardness, unable to relate to someone who had experienced something so far beyond normal childhood events, and teachers struggled with how to help a student who had demonstrated adult-level crisis management abilities but still needed 8th grade algebra instruction. She started writing about the experience, processing her thoughts and emotions through a journal that eventually became a book about fear, courage, and the weight of being responsible for hundreds of lives when you were still young enough to need permission to stay up past bedtime. The aviation community debated the Flight 227 incident for years afterward, with some experts arguing that Emma's successful landing proved that current training restrictions were too conservative, while others maintained that placing such responsibility on a child was traumatic regardless of the outcome and should never be repeated. Her father became an advocate for expanded aviation education, giving lectures about how Emma's unconventional training had saved lives and suggesting that simulators and proper instruction could give more people survival skills that might prove essential in emergencies. Critics pointed out that for every Emma Morrison there were thousands of children who lacked her natural aptitude and who would be traumatized by intensive emergency training that would probably never be needed, and that celebrating one successful outcome ignored the potential psychological damage to young people who were not equipped to handle adult responsibilities. The debate remained unresolved, one more example of how aviation safety often involved impossible choices between protecting people from risk and preparing them to handle emergencies that regulations assumed they would never face. Emma turned 13 3 months after the landing and requested only one gift: a promise from her parents that she would never have to talk about Flight 227 publicly again, that she could let the story fade into history while she focused on becoming whatever she wanted to be beyond the girl who had landed a plane. Her parents agreed, and Emma gradually withdrew from public life, refusing interview requests and declining invitations to aviation events where organizers wanted to celebrate her actions. She was last seen publicly at a small ceremony where the recovered captain presented her with his pilot wings, telling her that she had earned them more than many professional pilots ever would, and Emma accepted them with quiet grace before walking away from the cameras and reporters and everyone who wanted to turn her into a symbol of something larger than a frightened child who had simply done what needed to be done because there was nobody else who could do it. Years later, people still debated what the Flight 227 incident meant for aviation safety, child education, and emergency preparedness, but Emma herself remained largely silent on these questions, having learned that some experiences were too complex and too personal to fit into the neat narratives that the world demanded from its heroes.